The Chinese Civil War began in 1927 and was essentially a war between two political groups in China, the Nationalist Party, which will be referred to as the GMD, and the Chinese Communist Party, or CCP. In investigating its causes, it is impossible to completely separate them, and for a good reason. The real significance is hidden in how these factors are intertwined, but I will get to that later. First, the separate causes. Economically, following the collapse of the Chinese Empire, transition into a republic, and the rise of warlordism, the Chinese economy was in absolute disarray. Economic practices were backwards and extremely dated, having changed minimally over hundreds of years. Peasant farmers were still using poor farming techniques, were subservient to the powerful landlords, and industrialism, well, that was almost non-existent. Socially, the conditions were no better. Quality of life was poor, social traditions were dated and unnecessarily cruel, and all of this basically summed itself up with widespread poverty among the peasants. Of course, the backwards economy, well, that didn't help much either. Politics. This is where the meat of the Chinese Civil War is, as it was a very politically driven war, and at its core it boiled down to the GMD and CCP simply not being able to work together. This stemmed in part from the nature of the Chinese leadership structure. The Soviet Union forcing the CCP to merge with the GMD only created competition and dissent within the political structure, and with dual powers composing the government, both felt threatened and there was a substantial amount of friction between them. Warlordism and a divided China didn't help much either. Both the GMD and CCP sought to unite China, but because they could not work together, it became more of a competition between them than a concerted effort. But what truly caused the fundamental rift between these two groups was the conflicting ideology. The CCP had a focus on Chinese Marxism, where the peasantry would be the ones to incite revolution, while the GMD's Marxist-Leninist ideology appealed to the workers. With such opposing ideologies and no attempts at resolving them peacefully, the only option that remained was conflict. But how did these factors cause the war? Well, both the ideologies of the GMD and CCP and their policies affected peasants and poverty, but only the CCP really appealed to the peasants. This gave the CCP a power base to use in the future, as seen later on during the war itself. The poor social and economic conditions and the divided China ultimately created chaos with no governing body. This gave both the CCP and GMD motive to eliminate each other and seize the unification of China. And this conflict only came at the cost of the people, creating a downward spiral for the social and economic conditions that could only be settled under one leader. Finally, this all culminated with the Shanghai Massacre in 1927, thus sparking the conflict between the nationalists and communists and starting the Chinese Civil War.